Treason is not the reason for the season. Episode 19 Nunn v. Georgia, 1846. The 1846, Nunn v. Georgia ruling was the first time in U.S. history that a gun control law was overturned based on Second Amendment grounds. Little wonder, this nonsense that throughout 50 years of the founders' intentions was penned by Joseph Henry Lumpkin, a white supremacist judge who promoted slavery, and who supported the South seceding from the Union. The case was about Hawkins H. Nunn, who was charged with carrying a concealed weapon, in violation of Georgia law. Lumpkin mentions 3 cases involving a state constitution which specifically enumerated a right to bear arms for defense of self and defense of state. Bliss vs. The Commonwealth, Kentucky 1832. State v. Reed, Alabama, 1840. State v. Mitchell, Indiana, 1833. In Bliss vs. The Commonwealth, the Kentucky court overturned a gun regulation law because the Constitution of Kentucky states that the right of the citizens to bear arms in defense of themselves and the state shall not be questioned. In State v. Reed, the Alabama court overturned a gun regulation law because the Alabama Constitution states that every citizen has a right to bear arms in defense of himself and the state. In State v. Mitchell, the Indiana court upheld a gun regulation law, even though the Indiana state constitution states, the people have a right to bear arms for the defense of themselves and the state. 3 state constitutions that specifically enumerate a right to bear arms for self-defense. 2 gun laws were overturned. 1 gun law was upheld. So, this doesn't really establish anything. Even if these 3 cases did establish some pattern, the Nunn case took place in Georgia, and the Georgia state constitution has no right to bear arms clause whatsoever. So, if Lumpkin wanted to use some pattern from the other 3 cases, those cases don't apply to the Nunn case, because the Georgia state constitution doesn't have the same language as the other 3 states. But this didn't stop Lumpkin. Lumpkin states, "We are of the opinion, then, that so far as the Act of 1837 seeks to suppress the practice of carrying certain weapons secretly, that it is valid, inasmuch as it does not deprive the citizen of his natural right of self-defense, or of his constitutional right to keep and bear arms." Lumpkin said the gun regulation was okay for outlawing concealed carry, because people could still open carry, and therefore could still exercise their natural right to self-defense. Lumpkin invokes a natural right to self-defense, and declares out of thin air that this right is completely and totally without legal limit, and that this natural right to self-defense must have been the intention of the Second Amendment. Lumpkin writes, "Nor is the right involved in this discussion less comprehensive or valuable. The right of the people to bear arms shall not be infringed. The right of the whole people, old and young, men, women and boys, and not militia only." The 3 cases Lumpkin referred to dealt with state constitutions that specifically call out a right to bear arms for self-defense. These state constitutions have no bearing on Georgia law. And they most definitely have no bearing on federal law. And yet, completely out of nowhere, Lumpkin switches to the U.S. Constitution, quoting "the right of the people to bear arms shall not be infringed," out of context, conveniently dropping the first half that explicitly calls out militia service as the reason for the right. Having committed his shoddy street magician misdirection, Lumpkin then manifests out of thin air the idea that the Second Amendment must somehow, magically, invoke a personal right to armed self-defense. Once Lumpkin has sunk his teeth into this nonsense, he runs with it. To keep and bear arms of every description, not such merely as are used by the militia, shall not be infringed, curtailed, or broken in upon, in the smallest degree. Arms of every description shall not be infringed in the smallest degree. Lumpkin's argument here is so insane that it breaks multiple points of common sense. If you haven't already, go watch these earlier videos in the series. Number 5, Constitution and Bill of Rights. Number 11, Categories of weapons for the militia versus full-time army. Number 17, Second Amendment is about national defense, not self-defense. Number 18, Natural right to self-defense is not a constitutional right to self-destruct. In video number 5, it is explained that during the process to ratify the U.S. Bill of Rights, 5 state constitutions had no right to bear arms at all. 5 state constitutions had a right to bear arms tied only to militia service. And only 2 state constitutions had a right to bear arms for defense of self and nation. The founders were aware of all 3 of these types of state constitutions with regard to a right to bear arms or no right at all. If the U.S. Bill of Rights asserted a right to bear arms for self-defense, this would instantly overturn all existing gun control laws in these 10 states and possibly cause those states to resist ratification of the Bill of Rights. Gun control laws in those 10 states might require powder be stored safely, away from homes, because pounds of gunpowder sitting around was extremely dangerous. Might require guns be stored unloaded because they were dangerous, powder was a fire hazard, and muskets were unreliable. Might prohibit open and concealed carry. Might require that gunpowder for militia service be stored in a central powder house. Might require that guns for militia service be stored in an armory. The Federalists only cared about the federal government getting access to state militias. They didn't care about a personal right to bear arms. If the U.S. Bill of Rights pushed a right to bear arms only for militia service, then the Federalists got their militias, and states who had no right to bear arms could keep their gun control laws in place, and states with a right to armed self-defense could maintain that right within the state. A federal right to bear arms tied only to militia service would be compatible with every state's existing constitution and not cause resistance to ratification. Which is exactly the wording they chose for the Federal Bill of Rights. In video number 11, Categories of Weapons for the Militia versus Full-Time Army, the idea that the founders wrote the Second Amendment to enable anyone to keep and bear arms of every description, as Lumpkin wrote, is simply ridiculous. That would mean people have a right to small, man-portable tactical nukes, Molotov cocktails, brass knuckles, swords, spears, bayonets, and any other weapon small enough for a person to carry. The fact that Lumpkin ran with his activist judging all the way to this nonsense that the founders intended for civilians to keep and bear arms of every description should be a clear red flag that Lumpkin ran past his own self-constructed pseudo-legal scaffolding. There are weapons that are bearable but terrible, too terrible to allow civilians to possess. Even with the interpretation that the Second Amendment protects a right to bear arms for militia service, that doesn't mean the founders intended for civilians to be a weapons superstore to supply the full-time army. The founders didn't intend for militia members to have every military weapon under the sun. The Militia Act of 1792, passed 1 year after the Second Amendment was ratified, mandated a list of equipment for every member to possess. It was a single musket, 24-shot, and various gear such as packs, belts, bayonets, and such. The expectation was that militia members would supplement the full-time army, and the full-time army would provide heavy weapons such as cannons, and the full-time army would also supply militia members with ammunition once their 24 rounds were used up. The Second Amendment mandated that states allow these militia arms expected by the federal government for militia service, 1 musket, 24-shot, and a quarter pound of powder. All other arms were left to the states to regulate as they saw fit. The founders didn't mean for the right to bear arms for militia service to translate into an individual civilian owning an entire armory of machine guns, mortars, grenades, RPGs, and so on. The founders intended for militia service to mandate a minimum weapon, a single musket per person, and a minimum amount of ammunition, 24 rounds. That is what they enacted into law with the Militia Act of 1792. In video number 17, Second Amendment is about national defense, not self-defense. History is reviewed, again, to show that the Second Amendment only makes sense as a right to bear arms for militia service only. Nowhere in the legal text of the Declaration of Independence, Constitution, Bill of Rights, or Militia Act of 1792, nowhere in any of those legal documents does the phrase self-defense ever occur. And more specifically, absolutely nowhere does any of these legal texts carve out a legal right to armed self-defense as a federal right. The language is not there. Only 2 state constitutions spelled out a right to armed self-defense. Those constitutions were known when the Bill of Rights was being worked out. and that wording was rejected for the Federal Bill of Rights. In video number 18, natural right to self-defense is not a constitutional right to self-destruct, explains the difference between natural right and legal right is the difference between theory versus practice, idealism versus realism, hypothetical versus practical. A natural right is absolute, but each exists in a vacuum, without having to deal with the annoying details of the sometimes gritty, sometimes sticky, physical world. When a government establishes a natural right, it must balance the individual right with the societal right to justice for all, domestic tranquility, the general welfare, and so on. The only way for a government for the people, by the people, of the people, to implement individual rights into law, while maintaining the principles of liberty and justice for all, is to spell out the limits where the individual right ends and infringement on the rest of society begins. One may have an absolute and natural right to swing their fists, but the job of government is to spell out where the fist ends and where someone else's nose begins. Legal rights are seldom absolute. Lumpkin invokes a natural right to bear arms from 3 state constitutions, and uses that to manifest from thin air a legal right at the federal level that is absolute, a legal right that extends to everyone, even criminals and mentally ill, extends to weapons of any and all types, and cannot be infringed, in the slightest degree. If a natural right is an absolute legal right with no restrictions whatsoever, it is the same as no law whatsoever. An absolute personal right with no legal restriction to protect society will become a bludgeon by someone willing to subjugate others. Where there is no law, there is no freedom. John Locke. There is no right to armed self-defense mentioned anywhere in the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, or the Bill of Rights. No natural right. No legal right. One can read the Declaration of Independence declaring all have a right to life, and infer that this means all have a right to self-defense. But that's a natural right. To turn it into a legal right, the Constitution states government is formed to establish justice for all, liberty for all, establish domestic tranquility, and so on. At which point, the inferred natural personal right to self-defense will have to be limited to make sure it doesn't damage the right of society for liberty and justice for all. For example, even if people have a right to armed self-defense, shooting into the dark out of panic might end up killing your roommate who got up in the middle of the night to get a snack from the fridge, and so a duty to retreat becomes necessary to morally ground the right to self-defense and keep it from turning homes into some Wild West shootout. Panic should not be a blanket defense for poor choices that kill an innocent person when non-lethal choices were available. Black people scare me should not be a blanket get out of murdering someone card. When balancing the individual right to self-defense with justice for all and the general welfare, guns might be allowed for self-defense, but owners would have to be licensed showing they pass a background check, and guns would have to be registered to their owners so that they don't easily fall into the hands of criminals through the iron pipeline. Guns that are too powerful might be restricted from public possession for the damage that one person could inflict. And so on. From the principle that everyone has a right to life, liberty, and happiness, from the principle that the government exists to promote justice for all, to promote the general welfare of all, a right to self-defense can be created in a way that balances the individual and the people as a whole, balances the desire of an individual to have a gun with the desire of the rest of the population to not want that gun to easily fall into the hands of criminals, or be used to needlessly kill someone. When non-lethal alternatives were available, the right to self-defense might have to be balanced with the amount of damage a person can do carrying a concealed handgun everywhere they go. Carrying a concealed handgun might require an application that shows the person is regularly in significant danger, shows that they take safety training courses, and so on. And if after all these restrictions are implemented, if people with legal guns end up being a large source of tragic shootings, then the job of government to protect society would require an end to concealed carry. The right to self-defense might have to be balanced with the amount of damage a person can do with high rate of fire weapons. This might require that automatic weapons be banned. It might ban high-capacity magazines. The United States has some of the most permissive gun laws in the world, and the United States ranks near the top for most guns per capita. And the result of that is a gun homicide rate that makes the United States look like a war-torn banana republic. We already have more guns per capita of any nation, and one of the highest gun homicide rates in the world, so adding more guns, deregulating guns further, will not reduce crime. Watch video number 9, Attacking the Iron Pipeline, for data that shows just how bad it is. If the government is supposed to protect the natural right of armed self-defense while also protecting domestic tranquility of all people, then the natural right to armed self-defense must be balanced with the natural right of justice for all, especially justice for all those people murdered by easily obtained guns. If government is supposed to ensure domestic tranquility, then the individual right to bear arms for self-defense would have to be balanced with the fact that the U.S. gun homicide rate makes the U.S. look like a war zone. Those who are pushing for even more deregulation of gun laws, are balancing, what? Exactly? Nothing. The United States already has the most guns per person of any nation in the world. How, exactly, will even more guns balance anything? If the US already has more guns per capita of any country in the world, how will more guns, more deregulation of guns, lower the gun homicide rate? It won't. The loudest voices pushing for deregulation of guns are people wanting to terrorize civilians and people wanting to overthrow the government. The loudest voices pushing for deregulation will proudly tell you that a little rebellion now and then is a good thing, and will try to convince you that this was the founders' intentions, and ignore that the Constitution defined a little rebellion as treason. Watch video number 13, Thomas Jefferson, lone defender of Shays' Rebellion, to see how off your rocker, insanely wrong this is compared to actual history. As for the Nunn v. Georgia ruling, Lumpkin wasn't trying to balance anything either. Lumpkin was a white supremacist, pro-slavery, pro-secession judge who wanted to give the slave-owning South a natural right to bear arms that cannot be infringed in the smallest degree. Why? Well, the Nunn v. Georgia case happened in 1846. This was in the middle of the Cold War between slave and free states. From the Constitution Convention to the Civil War, the growth of the United States can be seen as a fight over whether slavery would be allowed to expand or not. The South wanted slavery to continue in new states to help maintain their electoral college advantage and also give new slave states extra seats in the House by counting 3/5 of slaves. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 admitted Missouri as a slave state and Maine as a free state, in exchange for a prohibition on slavery in new states above the 36th parallel. Thomas Jefferson became convinced that a Northern conspiracy was behind the Missouri Compromise to instate monarchical rule over the nation. Jefferson wrote of the Missouri Compromise as a death knell of the Union. Other Southerners saw the Missouri Compromise as an act of war. If you persist, the Union will be dissolved. You have kindled a fire which all the waters of the ocean cannot put out, which seas of blood can only extinguish. Representative Thomas Cobb, Georgia. Note that this man who saw the Missouri Compromise as an act of war, came from Georgia, the same state that the Nunn v. Georgia case took place, the same state Lumpkin is judge. The history of the United States shows that racists go along with democracy as long as democracy gives them exactly and everything they want. When democracy starts voting in other ways, racists go to war. Watch video number 23, Tale of Two Democracies, or It's the Racism, Stupid. To see this in detail. When the Constitution was ratified, slave states were given massive advantages in representation over the North, even though the North outnumbered the South. The Missouri Compromise was seen by slave states as a challenge to their advantaged position. From 1812 through 1850, maintaining the balance of free and slave states was such a battle that states were always added in pairs, one slave and one free. From 1851 until the Civil War, this balance stopped. 4 states were added, and all of them were free states. At the time of Lincoln's campaign for president, there were 19 free states and 15 slave states. The North outnumbered the South 20 million to 6 million. The advantages that the South had enjoyed for nearly a century from the Senate and from the Electoral College had finally disappeared. And on November 6, 1860, Lincoln won the presidential election. 3 days after Lincoln's election, South Carolina declared Lincoln's election, the result of a fair and legal democratic process, to be a hostile act and seceded from the Union. Before Lincoln was inaugurated into office on March of 1861, 7 slave states had already left the Union. 5 weeks after Lincoln was inaugurated, the South committed treason by taking up arms against the United States, bombarding Fort Sumter in an unprovoked attack, starting the Civil War. It was in the middle of this Cold War between North and South, Free State and Slave State, that the pro-slavery, pro-secession Lumpkin manufactured out of thin air an absolute and unlimited legal right to firepower of any kind, not to serve in government-controlled militias that would be subservient to the president, but as a personal, individual right to self-defense. Lumpkin found a way to enable white supremacists to arm themselves against democracy just 15 years before the South seceded. Georgia seceded in January of 1861, before Lincoln had even been inaugurated. Every bit of the Nunn case, from its shoddy sleight of hand, to its lousy understanding of natural versus legal rights, to its convenient selective quoting of the Second Amendment, to its using state constitutions with one wording, to reinterpret a completely different wording in the Federal Bill of Rights, all of this should have been relegated to the dustbin of history once the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments settled this nonsense of slavery and secession that Lumpkin was enabling. If that wasn't enough, then every bit of the Nunn case, being a ruling from a state justice, should not have set precedent for the Supreme Court of the United States. And if that wasn't enough, even if the Nunn case offered some precedent for the Supreme Court, anything from the Nunn ruling was wiped out, legally speaking, by the Cruikshank v. U.S. case of 1875, where the Supreme Court unanimously ruled. The Second Amendment declares that it shall not be infringed, but this, as has been seen, means no more than that it shall not be infringed by Congress. This is one of the amendments that has no other effect than to restrict the powers of the national government. Lumpkin wrote his Nunn ruling at the state level in 1846. The Supreme Court handed down the Cruikshank ruling in 1875. Cruikshank set unanimous precedent that rendered Lumpkin, and his Nunn nonsense, moot. After Cruikshank set this precedent, no justice with any respect for the rule of law, no justice with any respect for precedent, would have ever had the audacity to refer to the Nunn ruling for advice. This complete lack of respect for the law is the only possible explanation for the 2008 Heller decision. The Heller ruling resurrected the totally not precedent Nunn ruling, quoted it and referenced it a total of 5 times, completely disregarded the rule of law and precedent established by Cruikshank, and completely inverted the founders' intentions for the Second Amendment. The insanity that is Heller is explained in detail in the next videos. Treason is not the reason for the Second Amendment. Treason is not the reason for the season.